For 50 straight years, Charles Schulz never missed a single day drawing Peanuts.
How long does it usually take you to draw a strip?
Well, I can draw one of these daily episodes in an hour, and a Sunday page usually takes about 4 hours.
He built a global empire, earned millions, and became the most influential cartoonist of all time, all on his own. Then, in the early 2000s, Peanuts ended with almost no warning, leaving many fans confused and searching for answers.
Charles Schultz's last comic strip hit the papers today.
In an eerie coincidence, both the characters and their creator are gone.
At the time, Charles Schulz announced his retirement.
I knew that perhaps one day this would happen.
The explanation seemed straightforward, but it didn't tell the full story. Now the truth has finally been unveiled. When reality hits, Charles Schulz was extremely protective of Peanuts. Unlike many long-running comic creators who had writers handle the heavy lifting, he handled every aspect of the strip himself, making it his own. That intense level of control didn't come from ego or business strategy. It was rooted in who Charles had always been, and became the very reason Peanuts ended. Long before Peanuts became a global phenomenon, Charles was an emotionally neglected kid with a quiet upbringing until he discovered how to draw. Drawing became his escape from reality, the only way he could express himself without the fear of being judged, and that attachment shaped the very decision that led to the discontinuation of Peanuts. Charles spent hours reading strips like Skippy and Popeye, studying how they worked and copying their style. People noticed his talent early, and while he was still young, one of his drawings made it into Ripley's Believe It or Not, a small win that meant everything to him. Still, his path wasn't easy. Charles was extremely shy and often felt cut off from other people. He struggled socially and rarely felt confident. In high school, his drawings were rejected by the yearbook staff, a moment that stuck with him far longer than he let on. Instead of walking away, he retreated further into his work. He enrolled in correspondence art courses, choosing to learn alone at home rather than face classrooms filled with people he feared were better than him. That isolation shaped the emotional tone of his future work. In 1943, his life shifted abruptly. His mother died after a long illness, and shortly after, he was drafted into World War II. The combination of grief and war left a permanent mark. The combination of losing his mother and suddenly entering the army brought intense loneliness and shock. The isolation and harshness of military life compounded the pain, and his 3 years during the Second World War taught him everything he needed to know about being alone. Adding to the heartbreak, he never got to say a proper goodbye. His mother had tried to hide the severity of her illness, and on his final day passing from Fort Snelling, she turned away and told him they'd probably never see each other again. That moment haunted him for years, but Schultz found a way to channel that pain. Drawing and cartooning became more than a hobby. They became a refuge, a way to process his feelings and make sense of the world. By the time he returned home in 1945, Charles saw the world differently. He took a job as an art instructor, teaching while quietly developing his own ideas. Around this time, he began drawing a small comic strip called Lil Folks. It wasn't widely known, but it introduced the themes, tone, and characters that would later evolve into something much bigger. That turning point came on October 2, 1950, when Peanuts debuted in American newspapers. Over time, Peanuts grew into a global phenomenon, running in thousands of newspapers across dozens of countries, with its influence expanding through iconic television specials, massive merchandising, ties to NASA, and eventually a museum dedicated to Charles's life and work. Yet despite its scale and success, Peanuts did not fade out or get handed to a new generation of artists until it ended suddenly, sparking a reaction unlike anything the comic strip world had ever seen. For many, the final strip felt like a perfect goodbye. Written as a letter from Snoopy's typewriter, Charles thanked his audience and gently closed the door on a 50-year journey. Other readers openly admitted they cried upon reading Charles's farewell. Another fan famously described the moment as the day the laughter died, drawing a parallel to the cultural shock that followed Buddy Holly's death. But still, fans were confused. They had no real reason for the sudden end. Just one clause. It all began with just one clause. Charles Schultz made a deliberate and final decision about the fate of Peanuts, and he put it in writing long before the strip ended. From the beginning of his success, Charles insisted that Peanuts was inseparable from him. It was not a brand that could be passed down from one person to another, or a franchise that could survive without its original creator. To protect that strong belief, he wrote a clause into his syndicate contract stating that Peanuts would end the moment he stopped drawing it. Charles repeatedly explained that Peanuts was his personal voice on paper. Every line of dialogue and moment reflected his own thoughts and emotional struggles. This was not a decision made under pressure. Charles maintained this stance consistently, even as Peanuts became one of the most profitable and widely syndicated comic strips in history. Financially, it would have made sense to allow successors. Creatively, he refused. He believed the integrity of the work mattered more than its longevity. Charles deeply believed that allowing someone else to draw or write the strip would turn it into an imitation. To him, that would strip Peanuts of its honesty. He famously summed up his position by saying that he was the strip, and the strip was him. There was no separation between creator and creation. Another major motivation was Charles's belief that comic strips didn't have to rely on punchlines or slapstick to be meaningful. He wanted to create something more meaningful. Instead of jokes that reset every day, Charles focused on continuing emotional themes that people experienced but rarely saw represented in comics at the time. Charles was also deeply observant. He paid close attention to everyday conversations, especially the way children spoke and thought. The kids in Peanuts talk like adults, but they think and feel like children, which allowed Charles to explore big ideas through small, relatable moments. When nature demands. By the late 1990s, Charles Schultz suddenly got a rude awakening. His health had begun to unravel after decades of relentless hard work. For nearly 50 years, he maintained one of the most demanding routines in the history of creativity, personally writing and drawing every single Peanuts strip without interruption. That workload required daily concentration and emotional focus. Then, in 1999, that balance finally broke with just one hospital visit. That year, Charles was diagnosed with colon cancer, a turning point that immediately changed his ability to work. The illness drained his strength and made it increasingly difficult to keep up with the physical and mental demands of producing a daily comic strip. For someone who had never allowed a substitute artist and had never missed a deadline, this loss of control was devastating. His condition worsened rapidly. In November 1999, Charles was hospitalized after suffering multiple strokes and complications related to a blocked aorta. During this hospitalization, doctors discovered that the cancer had advanced and spread. The diagnosis confirmed what Charles had already begun to fear. Continuing Peanuts was no longer possible. On December 14, 1999, Charles made the announcement he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He officially retired from Peanuts, citing his declining health and the need to focus on treatment. The statement was the end of a career that had shaped generations, but it also showed Charles's deep sense of responsibility. He believed that if he could not produce the strip at the level he demanded of himself, then it should not continue at all. After Charles announced his retirement, his studio in Santa Rosa was flooded with hundreds of letters every single day. Readers wrote to say thank you, to share memories, and to explain how much Peanuts had meant to them. Many spoke of learning to read with Peanuts books, or of seeing themselves in Charlie Brown's self-doubt, Lucy's bravado, Linus's vulnerability, or Snoopy's imagination. Tragically, Charles did not live long after making that decision. He passed away on February 12, 2000, just one day before the final Sunday Peanuts strip was published. The timing reinforced the truth behind his retirement. The strip did not end because it lost relevance or popularity. It ended because its creator could no longer continue, and he refused to let it exist without him. But Peanuts did not just fade from existence. In fact, quite the opposite. Even decades later, the characters he created are still very much alive today. You see them in reruns, classic TV specials, a movie, and even a museum dedicated entirely to his work. And just like before, they still bring comfort to people. Fears laid bare. Fans never truly understood the man behind the strips until his death, because behind the humor and simple drawings was a life carved out by intense and sad emotions. Despite being read by hundreds of millions of people around the world, Charles moved through life with a persistent feeling of being unseen and unloved, as if the admiration surrounding his work never quite reached him on a personal level. He carried his pain quietly and permanently, holding onto every slight, every awkward moment, and every emotional wound, unable to forget them and unwilling to soften their impact. Happiness, as he saw it, was not something warm or lasting, but something fragile and fleeting, often tinged with sadness if it existed at all. Even joy felt suspicious, temporary, and destined to slip away. That darkness began early. As a child, a brief separation from his mother in a crowded streetcar planted a lifelong fear of abandonment. From that moment on, the idea of being left behind never loosened its grip. This fear bled directly into Peanuts. Love in the strip is rarely returned or rewarded and almost never safe. Characters reach out only to be met with indifference, rejection, or quiet cruelty. Hope exists, but it is fragile, constantly undermined, and often crushed without ceremony. Indifference becomes the most common response to vulnerability, mirroring the emotional world Schultz believed he lived in. The characters themselves feel less like inventions and more like fragments of his inner life. Charlie Brown's constant self-doubt, fear of failure, and repeated humiliation echo Schultz's own insecurities and upbringing, in which ambition was discouraged and confidence was something to be wary of. Lucy's harshness reflects emotional pressure and impatience with weakness, while Snoopy's imagination feels like an escape from a reality that was often too heavy to sit with for long. Even his most personal heartbreaks were absorbed into the strip. Failed relationships, emotional rejection, and private disappointments were quietly translated into panels read as jokes, their pain softened just enough to be palatable, but never erased. Strip by strip, Schultz laid himself bare, disguising confession as comedy. But even that vulnerability attracted critics who believed that while Peanuts may look gentle and harmless on the surface, they have stirred up more controversy than most people realize. One of the biggest flashpoints came in 1968 with the introduction of Franklin, the strip's first black character. Franklin wasn't added randomly. He came directly from a series of letters between Charles Schultz and a schoolteacher named Harriet Glickman, who urged him to reflect the real world during a tense moment in American history following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. While many readers applauded the move, others didn't. Some Southern newspapers threatened to drop the strip altogether, and many readers demanded that Franklin be removed. But Schultz refused to yield to their demands. He made it clear that Peanuts would run exactly as he drew it, or not at all. Even decades later, Franklin's portrayal sparked debate, especially in animated specials like A Charlie Brown Thanksgiving, where his seating arrangement at the table raised uncomfortable questions about tokenism and subtle segregation. Despite its reputation as a kid's comic, Peanuts was never completely neutral. Charles often slipped in commentary on the issues of his time. Themes tied to the Vietnam War, nuclear anxiety, feminism, and even prayer in schools quietly appeared through the characters' conversations and frustrations. Lucy's confidence, Peppermint Patty's rejection of gender norms, and the general sense of unease running through the strip reflected deeper cultural conversations. Not everyone appreciated that. Some readers preferred Peanuts as light, political humor, and felt uncomfortable seeing adult topics woven into a comic featuring children. Even the strip's title was a source of tension. Charles hated the name Peanuts. It was chosen by the syndicate, not him, and he felt it sounded trivial and undignified. His preferred title was Good Old Charlie Brown, which he believed better reflected the heart of the strip. Unfortunately for Charles, the name Peanuts stuck, and his dislike for it never really faded. As the strip aged, criticism also followed its creative direction. Some longtime fans felt Peanuts lost some of its emotional depth in later years. Early strips leaned heavily into Charlie Brown's anxieties, loneliness, and quiet struggles. Over time, Snoopy became more central, with imaginative storylines and alter egos taking the spotlight. While many readers loved Snoopy's antics, others saw the change as a move toward safer, more marketable content that softened the strip's original edge. Even A Charlie Brown Christmas, now considered untouchable, faced resistance at first. CBS executives worried it was too slow, too simply animated, and too openly religious. Linus reciting the nativity story made network executives especially nervous. None of that mattered once it aired. Audiences loved it instantly, turning it into a holiday tradition and proving that Charles's instincts were often stronger than industry expectations. A post-mortem lawsuit. Even after Charles Schultz passed away, Peanuts continued to stir up some drama. After Schultz's death, the trust that controls the Peanuts characters sued Mort Walker, the creator of Beetle Bailey and a longtime friend of Schultz. The dispute was over the ownership and return of 19 original Peanuts panels that Charles had loaned to Walker's International Museum of Cartoon Art years prior. These panels had been displayed at the museum, which eventually closed its doors due to financial difficulties. Once the museum ran into trouble, Charles's estate demanded that the loaned panels be returned immediately. The estate claimed full ownership of the strips and hoped to exhibit them at the Charles M. Schultz Museum in Santa Rosa, where Charles had lived and worked. The situation was rooted in a decades-old friendship between Schultz and Walker. In 1978, Schultz had sent Walker a letter officially lending him the 19 panels, with the understanding that they could be returned when Walker no longer needed them. At the time, the arrangement had been completely amicable, reflecting the mutual respect between two of the most iconic cartoonists in history. Walker, who had founded the museum and served on its board, displayed the panels at the Boca Raton, Florida Museum until its closure. After Charles passed away, the estate began taking a more active role in managing his artwork and ensuring that the Peanuts legacy was preserved, which eventually led to the legal dispute. Even though the lawsuit was filed in Sonoma County Superior Court and later moved to federal court in Oakland, the underlying issue was simple. The estate wanted to ensure the panels were properly preserved and publicly accessible. Some of the panels were reportedly missing, which only added to the tension. Walker insisted that he had never intended to sell the panels and still planned to exhibit them. He was focused on reopening the museum in New York and felt it was important to keep Charles's work in a collection alongside his own, which included one of the largest and most impressive archives of original cartoon art in the world. While Charles was alive, he personally handled the loans and trusted his friends to care for his work. After his death, however, the estate's priority was to protect his legacy and ensure that Peanuts remained properly represented in public exhibitions. Despite the legal disputes, both sides seemed to share a common goal of keeping the artwork accessible to fans and preserving its cultural value. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.